Welcome back. Our upcoming session for today is Himalayan Journeys, a discussion between Samgutu, Garry, Tony Wheeler, and Jonah Lenin. Our panel today includes authors who all have a great love for the Himalayas. Garry Weir's experiences are reflected in his book Trekking in the Indian Himalayas, as well as his travel narrative A Long Walk in the Himalaya, an account of his epic 5-month trek from the source of the Ganges to Kashmir. He has also written Kashmir, a journey throughout history that offers a highly readable account of Kashmir's rich and sometimes checkered cultural history. Dr. Jonah Lenin is a curator at the National Museum of Australia. He is a best-selling author, former international ski racer and explorer. Jonah was the first person to traverse the western Himalayas alone, walking solo 2,700 kilometers from Pakistan to Nepal. His research interests are in the relationship between walking, creativity, and storytelling. His books include River Trilogy, Into the Heart of the Himalayas, and Perfect Motion. Tony Wheeler is the founder of Lonely Planet and the Planet Wheeler Foundation. The session will be moderated by Padma Shri Tsamgutu, the founder of Rimu Expeditions and the Ladakh Marathon. Join us for an exciting talk as Garry, Jono, and Tony take us on their respective journeys across the Himalayas.
First of all, I'd like to thank all three of you being part of this Ladakh Literary Festival 2020. And it's great to have people, all legions who have become a part of this event. And it has raised the bar of this event to an international level. And really, thank you for being part of it on behalf of the organizer and from myself. And for me, it's a real privilege to talk to personalities like it's all three of you. It's all all legendary in the travel segment. And when I started trekking, I used to carry a Lonely Planet guidebook everywhere, and it was written by Garry and published by Tony. So we have two of the people whom I really wanted to talk to for a long time today. I've got the chance, and it's a privilege, real privilege to talk to you. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and then we also have Dr. Jonah Lenin, who has done just an amazing journey of covering about 2,700 kilometers in some of the remotest part of this world. And it was so great, and I would have never would have got an opportunity to read his book, but because of this festival, I managed to. It was such a captivating. I would say I managed to finish it in just one sitting. So I really feel good about after reading that book. Thank you, Juno, for being part of this event.
Thank you so much. And I should say quickly that I was mentioning to Tony just the other day that when I got off the bus the very first time in Leh, what did I have in my hand but Garry Weir's Lonely Planet Indian Himalayas? And I walked straight up to the Deluxe guest house to get a room.
Okay, yeah, and then it's so. Sometimes it's really feel nice that so many people, Ladakh being such a small, you know so many common friends, you know each other. Delex is a very good friend of mine, been knowing for so long from our college days. So we have a lot of people who bring us together. So to start with, I think I'll start with Garry because that's among the first one to visit the Himalaya among the three of you. And when he was visiting Kashmir, I had just was admitted to the school in Kashmir. I did my schooling in Kashmir, and I was and I was so fortunate to have been put into a school in Kashmir which had so many activities outdoor. And I remember one of our headmaster used to always admire and used to talk about some of his old students and the alumni, saying that how they are, leading the tourism industry in Kashmir. And I still remember that one name, Yusuf Chapri, and you say, he arranges treks for some of the most important people from different parts of the world, and he arranges trekking, and it's like a moving 5-star hotel. So to start with, Garry, I really wanted to know to how the trekking industry started in the early, I think late 60s started in Nepal, and then early 70s, how trekking was like in those days. It was really interesting to know.
Well, I think the organization, both in Kashmir and also in Ladakh, was pretty rudimentary to begin with. A lot of organizations who had organized treks in Nepal decided when Ladakh was opened in 1974 that they wanted to replicate their system out there, bringing over sort of cooks, bringing over guides, etc. And I think within just a very few years, Ladakh was certainly the place to go. I know my initial sort of impressions of Ladakh was, oh my God, I can't, after being in Kashmir, it looked very stark, quite uninviting. But once you got started, you realize it had tremendous possibilities. And I think a lot of that then just sort of developed from there. Those early days as well, that's before guidebooks. There were well-trodden trails linking up the villages, linking up the settlements, linking up the monasteries. And it certainly became very popular, particularly for European groups in those early days, right up until the early 1980s, when it got an attraction more from the Americans and the Australians, and things just started on from there.
No, but I understand that, Garry. But what about the logistics? The kind of equipment those days, the staff with the crew used to go. I mean, I'm sure since it was just the beginning of the industry, what was it like? I mean, now you see that most of the trekking in the Himalaya, the staffs are most of the staffs come from Nepal, and they're the best in the trade. But in the early days in Kashmir, I'm not sure whether you had people coming from Nepal. It was mainly the Kashmiris. So how you compare those people with the staff we have in present days?
I see where you're coming from now, because yes, you're right. To begin with, it certainly was the Kashmiris coming across to Ladakh and organizing things rather than the Ladakhis themselves. But it didn't take too long for the Ladakhis to catch up, and they obviously had very, very good guides. They knew the trails, and within a few seasons, they were establishing a presence themselves as well. The big difference, though, between Nepal and Kashmir and Ladakh is that there are pretty well established trails already in Nepal from the late 1960s, early 1970s, where people could go from lodge to lodge, from village to village, without too much infrastructure. Whereas the treks that were undertaken in Ladakh were far more demanding in terms of you really did need to have a good guide with you. You did need to know the terrain. You took all your tents with you. You were completely self-sufficient. So it was a completely different ball game from those, from coming from Nepal to undertaking the trek in Ladakh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds really great. So then I like to ask Tony. In 1972, Kathmandu must have been a very interesting place. There's a photo of Maureen in front of a shop which reads Central Hashish Store.
We always say,
it wasn't the hashish that they were dealing in there. It was really a front for changing money, because you had to go to a bank to change travelers' checks, and it was so time consuming doing money exchanges in the bank. It was much faster to go to the central hashish store. The hashish was of no interest at all. It was money that you were after.
Oh, so it was a way of attracting people to come and change money there.
Yeah,
So
I think that's the real answer.
Yeah, and I remember as a young boy, in the early 70s. I think the movie was released in 1971. The name of the movie was a Bollywood really big movie. One of the India's legendary actor Deva Anand was part of that movie. The name of the movie was Hare Rama Hare Krishna, and most part of this movie was shot in Nepal, and it gave a little bit about the Kathmandu's hashish tourism culture. I remember you singing that song, humming during school days, and we were not. I remember our teachers not allowing us to sing that song. So, and then I think it was, around the same time, 1972, when I was sent by, to join to Kashmir to attend school by in the month of September, and I think it was probably around the same time when you and Maureen, embarked on a trip, driving a car which you bought for about 150 pounds, and London, driving through Europe to Istanbul, the gateway of Asia, across Iran, and to arrive in Kabul, where you sold a car for a profit of £5. Tony, describe us what was Kabul like those days, because I have seen photographs of women in skirts and carrying designer bags and wearing shades, and now the way the things have changed. It is something which is beyond comprehension. I mean, how you say about that?
Look, a lot of things have changed. A lot of things have changed for the worse, I think. You meet people who look back to that era, when there was a lot more business and the carpet business was much stronger, and we had certain places that you always ended up in that era. And in Kathmandu, it was Freak Street, which was around, the center of old Kathmandu, whereas, later on the center of gravity shifted across town. It went up to Tamil in the north of Kathmandu, where the Kathmandu guest house is. But the equivalent of that in Kabul, in Afghanistan, was called Chicken Street. And Chicken Street was the area of the market at one point where you went to buy a chicken. That's why it was called Chicken Street. And there was a particular, if there was an equivalent of the Kathmandu guest house, it would be this restaurant called Siggy's. And everybody who went there ended up, it was obviously, started by a German whose name was Siegfried, but everybody ended up there, and that was the sort of center of it. And remarkably, when I was in Kabul in 72, I stayed in a hotel called the Mustafa. And as soon as Afghanistan briefly reopened after 9/11, the Mustafa Hotel reopened. It was still there. It was the son of the owner, and it became the center where all the journalists went to. So there was that sort of continuation of things. But I didn't go up to Kashmir in 72. It wasn't till 1980 that I first went to Kashmir. So really, I missed out on that early phase of Kashmir.
Mm-hmm. Because it has changed a lot since then. I've seen the best times in Kashmir, and now what has happened, Garry knows about it very well. So the next I would like to bring in Dr. Jono. Jono, it's just the extraordinary journey you took from the Muslim Himalaya of Pakistan to the Buddhist Himalaya of Ladakh and Spiti, and finally into the Hindu Himalaya of Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. It's just, it's an amazing journey you took. And I believe under very tragic circumstances, a journey of 2,700 kilometers among the most remote places in the world, all on your own. Tell us what led to your decision to such a journey and why the Himalayas?
Oh, well, I'll have to give the abbreviated version on this. So, I mean, the reason that I went to the Himalayas actually goes back to when I was a child in Belfast. And on Saturday mornings, my mom used to take us down to the library. And when we got down to the library, we would choose our books for the week. And then I would usually drift over to the mountaineering books. And those were very popular in Britain in the 70s and 80s. And I remember looking through those books and seeing men and women in these beautiful bright colored down jackets way up on peaks in the Himalayas with this bright white snow all around and that crystal clear blue sky. And of course, that was completely different to Belfast when I was a kid because we were in the midst of really what was an undisclosed civil war. And so even as a child, I wanted to go to the Himalayas. And, you know, people who know about the book and know about my own journey know that, you know, one of the watershed moments in my life was when my little brother died in a tragic boating accident in Canada. And, you know, that sent me on really what was a downward spiral for a couple of years. And when I reached the bottom of that spiral, it was that image from my childhood of the Himalayas that kind of snapped me out of it. And I decided that I wanted to go to the Himalaya. And so I saved up my money, I got on a plane, and then I got on the bus in Delhi up through Kashmir, another bus up from Srinagar up to Leh. And I remember, as I said, you know, I got off that bus in Leh with a copy of Garry Weir's Lonely Planets, Indian Himalaya Guide, and I walked up to the Deluxe guest house. And I was a little bit, you know, initially I was a little bit disillusioned because, of course, as you're coming into Leh from Srinagar, you pass through all the army camps and the airport down below, and it's not the most romantic vision of Ladakh going through the army camps. But almost as soon as I started to meet Ladakhi people, then I realized that there was something special about this place, and especially something special about the people there. And you know what ended up, I went there for one season of trekking, and I ended up spending 8 years on and off in Ladakh and the Western Himalayas. And the culmination of that trip was this trek. Now, initially, the reasoning behind me undertaking that trek was completely selfish. It was my own ego. And that was because after all those books that I'd read as a child with Chris Bonington and Doug Scott and Dougal Haston, I thought, oh yeah, you know, I want to be like them. I want to be the first person to walk alone across the Western Himalayas. But, as you know from the book, as the farther that I got into this trek, the more I started to realize that something very special and very magical was happening to me. And at that point, superficially, I didn't realize that this was all about my brother. But eventually, when I finished the trek, you know, of course, I felt really happy about that, and I wrote the draft of the book, and 3 months after that, living in Dharamsala. But I remember going back to that first draft and saying, wow, this is really bad writing. This is junk. Nobody's ever going to publish this. And that really started the second journey. And the second journey was actually the writing of the book and my coming to the understanding of what the story really is all about. And of course, as a writer, that's actually, you know, your first job is to understand the story and know that you have something important to tell other people. And it took me many, many years to understand what the real story behind that trek was. And of course, the real story was that it was a journey, a pilgrimage, a yatra about coming to terms with my own brother's death. And so that, of course, was the deeper motivation for undertaking that trek.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really enjoyed the book. Uh, just in the beginning of your journey, you land up in this village in Pakistan, Astore, and you walk into a gun shop, which in your world displayed greater selection of weapons at gunsmith than of vegetables in the bazaar.
Yes.
Yeah, that image was for me was very striking and terrifying. Did you not hesitate? Because at the beginning of the journey, you saw that thing. I mean, what was your reaction to that? And maybe I'm not sure whether was it your upbringing, your growing up in Belfast in any way help you to cope with such a situation?
Yeah, I think we have to chalk that one up to the folly of youth. If I saw a gun shop in Pakistan now, I would not go in it. But the truth was that at that point in time, I was a young guy. I was, and I was very, very open to experience. And when I saw that gun shop, I mean, there was no way I was going to walk past that. And of course, I was rewarded with an incredible conversation and many, many beautiful cups of tea. And of course, an insight into culture in northern Pakistan, and especially the relationship between guns and manhood in northern Pakistan, which is still very evident there today. Now, I remember, going in there, and at the time, I didn't realize that that was such a significant conversation. But of course, in retrospect, I'm putting in the perspective of my past and being in Belfast, and actually, I don't like guns. I have a bit of a fear of guns. I've handled lots of guns because I worked as a forester in Canada for 18 years, but it's not something that I'm comfortable with. But at that point in time, it was something that I wanted to engage in. And, when you're open and when you're in a way vulnerable, you can be rewarded with those amazing conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's because after a couple of years, I think it was in 2013. We all know what happened at the base of Nanga Parbat, not far from Astore, where this huge massacre took place. Militants walking to the base camp and shooting. So, and Gilgit-Baltistan have been peaceful for so long. This kind of incident never occurred. So, but I was just thinking whether at the time whether you got a sense of this it was something like that it was coming or something. That's why I asked you this question.
Yeah, that is actually a good question because even at that time, Baltistan and Ladakh are very close culturally. I mean, there's been those ties there for thousands of years. But there was no doubt that there was definitely more of an edge to the population in Gilgit and Baltistan compared to Ladakh. I have to admit, when I crossed the border and I started walking again out Kargil, I was honestly much more relaxed. I mean, because I knew Ladakhi people very well, and I had so many friends there. But on top of that, I think that area in Pakistan has been in conflict for so long that it's inundated the population in some way. And from the book, the first couple of nights that I slept there, I was actually very nervous. I'd heard stories about bad things that had happened on Deosai Plateau, and another quite famous ski racer, Ned Gillette was his name. He was actually killed up in the Baltistan area when some people tried to rob him and his wife. So, there was a lot of stories there. And, but I also have to say, and I've mentioned this many times before, that there's a big, big difference between walking alone in an area like that and walking in a group. My understanding and my experience right across the Himalayas is that people are hospitable, people are generous, and people are compassionate. And when you show up as a single individual with a backpack on, dusty, tired, dirty hair, people do not turn you away. They take you in. They want to look after you. And that was my experience, you know, in general in Pakistan, of course, in Ladakh and Lahore and Spiti, and right across Garhwal and Kumaon. You know, people are good. That is my experience of the world. And I always say, you know, Tony and I talked about this just the other day. You know, when I started this trek, I had lost a lot of faith. You know, faith in the future, because when someone takes your brother like that, or something takes your brother like that, what actually happens? You know, you lose faith. I lost faith in the future. I lost faith in a lot of ways in myself, and I lost faith in humanity. And what that trek, that time in the Himalayas did was reinstill that faith.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, coming to Garry, you know, Garry, you did this long walk in the Himalaya, which we wrote a book on that on the journey in 2003. What really really was interested me was, after completing such a long journey, some of the most beautiful part, and that too after many years, after leading so many trips, organizing fantastic trips all across the Himalaya while you were with World Expedition. And because of, the problems in Kashmir, you managed to get such a long time to go on a walk on your own. Tell me, the last, we were stopped by the army because of security reason. You were not permitted to go to Gangabal, which you really intended to go and finish your trip. But then that last 5 days, why it was so important that you again came back in 2004 and finished that 5 days trek? What was the main reason that you wanted to go to Gangabal, and what was can you tell us that?
Well, Gangabal is one of the sacred sources of the Indus, and I was intent in, I'd collected water from Darmuk, which is the sacred source of the Ganges, and I wanted to finish by pouring the water into Gangabal. And so it was imperative for me to come back the next year and just complete that section of the trip to ensure that journey was completed. I could have bypassed the army quite easily, but I was in a frame of mind then when I thought, all right, okay, if it's not going to be this year, I'll come back again next year and complete it. It was as simple as that. And I certainly wasn't going to sell myself.
You had made up your mind to come back, because you left the bottle of that water from the Ganga Jal with the at the houseboat with the Bhandari family, whom you've been staying. So you had decided to come back right there because you realized that that's what you want to finish that trip. Even if it's just 5 days walk, the last 5 days. I mean, it's actually 3 days from Narana. You can do in 2 days, but up and down, it's 5 days. So it shows that you had some kind of an emotional, or to finish that trip with visiting at Gangabal. So my next will be with Tony. Tony, tell me, which year you first decided to publish a guide book on trekking in the Himalaya, and which was it, and who was the one who was the author of that book?
Well, the first trekking book we did was the Nepal guide, Nepal trekking book. And I guess because Nepal was the main center for trekking at that stage, the trekking hadn't taken off in Ladakh to the same extent, or in India. So Nepal was the first one, and we did that. First of all, I think it was 1976. but it was more a general guide to trekking in general. It wasn't the sort of the route guide telling you what was going to happen each day of the walk. That really came along a couple of years later. But trekking has changed so much over the years. You know, at first it was much more the sort of the camping out, the expedition style trekking, where you have the guides, you have the cook, the whole sort of entourage, really sort of based on that sort of mountaineering concept. You know, the whole Everest concept, where you had so many people doing it, whereas now in a lot of places you go from tea house to tea house and lodge to lodge. So the trekking has changed a lot over the years, and I've been fortunate to do a fair amount of trekking, more in Nepal than elsewhere, but also in Tibet. I have done some trekking in Tibet, but I think, you know, walking is the same almost anywhere in the world. It has different ways of doing it, but I've done a lot of walking in Europe. I've done some walking in America, walking in Australia and New Zealand, and basically, and Jonah will definitely agree with this. It's, you know, it's putting one foot in front of another, and that is the way. That is the best way of doing it, the best means of transport. You know, that's the way that God or gods intended us to move from A to B. And I've always been a walking enthusiast, and I'll be very unhappy when I can't get some walking in every year.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, the whole trekking, you know, it's changing all across the world. So, you know what, you know, the Everest base camp trek was like in the early, you know, 70s and 80s. Later on, now it's so commercialized. In fact, now most of the trekking routes, you know, we have been seeing that lodges are coming up. In fact, a year back, I was in the north side of Kanchenjunga, and earlier Kanchenjunga had hardly any lodges. Now I see that the lodges are coming everywhere. So don't we, you know, the Indian subcontinent, we have issues with unable to control the construction of keeping even the national parks, you know, having wet environment issues. Do you think, Tony, that in the years to come, all this pristine, these walks may just become one long street, like Everest from Lukla to Punamche is almost becoming one long street?
It is a serious concern. I mean, we've certainly seen that, you know, every year you can drive a bit further before you have to start, before you have to walk. And I think a lot of places that we saw as walking territory, that's no longer the case. And yeah, I regret that. I really do think it's a pity. But, you know, I also think how I've done a fair amount of walking in England, and it's remarkable how many walks where you come into this small town or small village, and the walk is still the way people used to come into that place 500 years ago. Now there's a road that comes in, and, you know, most people arrive by car, but the walking tracks are still there. They still exist.
Absolutely, I agree. I mean, look at the Lake District. I mean, you see the kind of, you know, regulations they have building new, even in fact repairing buildings. It's so stringent that, I mean, that's the reason they have been able to keep those areas, you know, same like what it was a couple of hundreds years ago. And that's what is missing in this part of the Himalaya. And this question is to Juno. Juno, while going through Zanskar, you arrive in this village, Lingshet. You talked a great deal of your stay in that village, and it is clear how much you enjoyed your time there. This year, it has become connected by a road. You know, it was a big celebration. Definitely, the people out there, they need the road. But, you know, but your perspective, how do you feel about such remote areas being changed by modern times? Do you think it could lose its charm? What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And Garry and I have actually talked about that in relation to Zanskar. You know, Zanskar being connected now with multiple roads. And in truth, you know, it's almost selfish for me to talk about this because I don't live in Zanskar. And what do Zanskari people want? What do people in the northwest of Nepal want? If you ask them what they want is roads. They want access to markets for their dairy products and for their apples and for their apricots because they see that as a source of economic security. Now, that also means that the traditional culture there is going to change. But culture is always changing. You know, I'm a museum curator, so I look at culture a lot. And culture across the world is in constant flux. And I don't think, you know, the basis of culture in the Himalayas, in Zanskar and Ladakh is related to, number one, Buddhism, and number two, to the landscape. Those two things are not going to change. And the third element, of course, is the family structure. So those three elements are not going to change. You know, the biggest change in Ladakhi culture over the past 50 years was, you know, access to the southern plains, to the Indian plains. And that has changed Ladakh in a way, but the essence of the culture is still there. I can feel that when I go there. So, yes, of course, I'm sad about the fact that Zanskar may lose some of its very, very special culture. But at the same time, I have a lot of confidence that the kernel of that culture, the part of that culture that is almost immutable, will stay there with the people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean, relating to this, I come to Garry. Garry, you know, all like as Tony also just mentioned, that in the Himalayan region, many traditional trails, trekking routes we are losing to road construction and also so we call the development. So soon, I think there won't be any trekking trails left until in places like Ladakh, unless and until they open new areas. What do you think about the future of trekking? Not just in the Himalayas, but also in the global context. In some parts of the world now, they're only the real, you know, pristine walker are all they all lie in the parks. That's all.
I couldn't agree with you more. When I get out on the rostrum, one of the things I will endorse what Jono has just said, and Tony as well, that essentially the whole thing, we live in a very privileged chapter where we have been able to go out and explore villages and settlements many days away from the nearest roadhead. Things are changing, they're changing rapidly. And the old adage that, you know, trekkers want to see remote villages, but remote villagers want roads. That is a fact that we have to accept. Who are we to argue against it? But you raised the question about national parks, and I totally agree. There are some wonderful wilderness areas in Ladakh which are still way beyond the confines of roads.
Yes.
And it is really going to be up to the Indian government and also to the state government in Ladakh as well to look very carefully at their national park policy. Because we've got, in one respect, we've got roads being built into some of the national parks, Marker Valley being a classic example. And one of the things I am sort of very content about is the fact of, for instance, just using that as an example, the Himalayas National Park, if it was extended south, could go all the way across to the Zanskar, because one thing we do have to consider is new generations, both domestic trekkers and foreign trekkers, is that we want them to replicate, to get something of our experiences that we've had for the last 50 odd years or so. And so it's very important, not just in terms of opening up new areas, but at the same time, looking at the real value of the national parks and ensuring that we have a policy there, just as they do in Europe, in the UK, in Australia, because the next generation of trekkers are going to be just like the walkers in Europe, the walkers in North America, the walkers in Australia, where we walk in national parks. That's an established sort of norm. And I think the sooner sort of governments, both in India and in Nepal, face up to that, then again, I think it can augur very well for the future, but it has to be taken very seriously. It cannot be always left to the likes of politicians to say, oh, we should put more roads in, without understanding the cost to the environment, because that, in the end, is all we've got.
Absolutely. We hope, the sooner the better we get, sense. The last.
One thing there.
Pardon?
Can I say that, in relation to what Garry had to say, you have environmental protection that you need to try and sustain and keep some of these wilderness areas, especially with the burgeoning Indian population. But on top of that, you have this very, very special Ladakhi culture, a culture that's developed in that landscape and with that religion and with those family structures. And it's organizations like LAMO, like Ladakh Ecological Society, like SECMOL that are continuing this culture and giving this culture to not just the children of Ladakh, but also people around the world. And there's something very special about that. And I really want to encourage the Indian government to support these organizations to help keep this culture intact, because what attracted me to Ladakh and the Himalayas, and I'm sure Garry would agree with me here, was that particular Ladakhi culture that we all hold so close to our hearts. So please, let's support Ladakhi culture through government interventions and by building it up.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. So, we need more awareness, probably, especially about the coming generation, creating awareness among, the students, teaching all these aspects of the environment, culture right from the school level. The past few years, I will say the past over a decade of almost now a decade and a half, it's for Tony. There's a big surge growth of domestic Indian people going to the Himalaya, trekking in different parts of the Himalaya. And it's growing, the numbers, with a country of now almost over 1.3 billion, a trickle of that, fraction of that people start going up. The numbers will be huge. In the context of problems like over tourism, environmental damage, tell us, Tony, can we look to Bhutan as a model, as a reference for tourism and travel, and whether it will be successful in the long run? Because, they do have this high cap pricing, which they call it the high, what you call only the high-end tourism, which will have less impact on the nature resources, on the environment, all the different aspect of the community of the mountain. So do you think it's a good way to replicate in other parts of the Himalaya?
I don't, it's a very easy way to say we'll keep the numbers down and keep the damage down just by charging a lot of money. We'll make travel something only for the wealthy. We'll turn the Himalaya into one Aman resort after another. And I think, we can have room for the wealthy, but I don't want to see young people cut out. I think that, young people or people without so much money, it's very important, the contact and the context they bring to tourism. And I think Jonah's book really does underline that. Everywhere he goes, he finds people are welcoming. They open doors to him. They make him tea. They're almost insulted if he offers to pay. And I think, we should be paying. We do have to, as tourists who are wealthy, be putting money back into the economies the places that we're enjoying. But I don't want it to be strictly financial business. But as you say, the numbers of domestic tourism in any country is important. We're certainly seeing that right now with the pandemic, where tourism is coming back much more to a local activity. That the long distance tourism is going to be the last thing to really recover. But I don't want to see tourism strictly a thing for the wealthy. So in that respect, I'm not happy about using Bhutan as a model. I don't think that's necessarily the best way for tourism to operate.
Because many people now, Ladakh is now, at a crossroad, Tony. While we have now crossed almost 300,000 people who've visited before the pandemic last, few years back. So many people are talking about the high-end tourism we should get. But what I feel is that we need to bring up the perspective of high-end tourism as something you don't see as about money, but I think it's a mindset. We need to change that. I mean, someone I think my thought on that is that someone who is putting less impact on the nature resources, less impact on the environment, less impact on the culture and way the people live. I think that's what the high-end tourists are. Doesn't matter they're staying in home, and the high-end tourists are the ones who are creating the maximum pressure on the natural resources, whether it be a water, whether it's to do emission of CO carbon emission, or whether it's to do traveling in having the impact is more. So I think the one of the most important thing is that the mindset of a high-end tourism should be the one who does the minimum impact on the area, on the region, is the high-end tourism. So what do you say that to creating these kind of awareness?
Yeah, look, I mean, if your high-end tourism is defined as you fly there in your private jet and you get up there in a helicopter and you're demanding electricity and air conditioning and heating, there may be fewer of you and you may be putting more money in, but you're certainly having more impact than someone who's just staying in a tent and is getting there on their own 2 feet. So I think that, the high-end tourism, it may have its virtues in that there may not be such big numbers and yet they bring in big money, but they also can bring in a very heavy impact. So it's not all good by any means.
And also, I mean, not every segment of the society will benefit from such high-end tourism. Even we need to have to support the small guest house, the small chai walas, the rickshaw walas. I mean, where will they go if we are only talking? So this is one thing I think. Very recently, we have been talking in Ladakh of very high-end tourism. So I think we need to keep that in mind. So I don't see we having much time now. We're almost there. So to really wrap up, I'd like to ask all of you, I mean, all three of you, how do you see the future of travel after this pandemic? Tony, you come first.
Well, I think we're going to see the tourism that comes back first from the pandemic is going to be two things. It's going to be more local tourism. So I think you probably will see more domestic tourism and less of the international visitors. But I hope it'll also be low impact tourism, that we don't want to be crowded into things. We don't want the large numbers. And of course, walking is, very often when you're walking, you're off by yourself. You're not crowded in elbow to elbow. So I think that there's, a lot of possibilities and good things that can come from this. And I hope that, when I'm looking at what I hope to get back to in the next couple of years when I can travel again, a lot of it is involved in walking and doing things at a slower pace.
Yeah. Well, just recently, Garry, now we have a tunnel through the Rotang Pass. You drive within an hour, you are in Kelong, hour and a half. So during the pandemic, when this the people trying, tourists going into these going into Lahore, and then the number of tourists went into that area, in Lahore and Spiti. There's some village where all, almost every individual of that village was infected by COVID. So see, this is another worry with that, people from the towns, when unless until this thing doesn't get over, till the vaccine doesn't go, it's really it's very risky for people to travel into these remote areas in the Himalaya and gets the local people infected. And what do you say about how should we be able to control that in remote parts of the Himalaya where there are no medical facilities available?
I think that generally, and I know with the Australian Himalayan Foundation, we've been watching all the statistics coming out from Nepal, and the remoter the villages, the far less incidence of COVID. And I think that's also the case with Ladakh. So yes, you are going to be away from medical facilities, but you've always been away from medical facilities anyway. So I don't think that is really an issue. I feel more concerned moving through Kathmandu or moving from Delhi than I would when I'm out on a remote mountain trail in Ladakh or on a more remote mountain trail in Nepal. I feel far, far safer. And so
yeah. So no, Garry, I'm coming in front from the people there, like people from cities going into these areas. So if they are carrying this virus and then they spread it in the remote parts of the Himalaya, that's where my concern is coming from. So as I told you, that one whole village, Thorang village, was infected. Every individual was found with COVID, and it only happened because of tourism. So that's where you see what kind of precaution should we, be very, very cautious traveling into these remote areas till these things doesn't get over.
Okay, no, I'm sorry, I got the question upended on 180 degrees on that one. Yeah, absolutely. And until there is a vaccine rolled out throughout India, then basically I think we've got to discourage people going into remote areas. Once we've got once vaccine has been rolled out and India looks well prepared for that, then and only then can we begin to encourage both domestic tourists and also foreigners as well going into more remote areas. Certainly, that to me I think is a given. We've got control. We have to get that vaccine out before we can take people any further. Because it's the most vulnerable. Yeah, the more
absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, hope people are listening to what you're saying. And Juno, this probably will be my last question to you. You have written that walking became I've read that you've written that walking became my filter. The goodness I experienced in the Himalayas came to me from the ground up. And in your recent research, you tell us, recent research tell us that walking brings creativity. Please tell us more about it.
I think Garry and Tony are both having a little chuckle here because I could talk about this for an hour.
Like kind of short. I mean, yeah. But it's something really, it brings creativity out of people. I think, all the people and the advertising people should go walking everywhere,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, and the examples are there, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Barack Obama, all of them are big walkers, and they all say that they get their best ideas when they go for a walk. Very quickly, the Reader's Digest condensed version of this is that when you go for a walk, it changes the way that you think through your through your neurotransmitters, through your neuroelectricity, and through your neuroanatomy. All of these things change when you walk to create a more open and spacious mindset that lets you think about things in a more divergent way. It makes you consider problems and principles that you hadn't thought of before in a different context. And this means that it gives you more ideas. It doesn't necessarily mean that when you're out for a walk that you'll be able to apply those novel ideas that you have, but it will give you more novel ideas. And that's what history shows us. When you think back to Aristotle, it's been with us for 4 million years. When we walk, we think in a particular way, and we think in a particularly creative way. And that creativity is actually based on the activity that you're focused in. And I always say, because people say to me, okay, well, what about a region like Ladakh where people have been walking a lot outside on the farms? And I say, yes, well, Ladakhi people are extremely creative, because look what they've done with that environment. That is one of the most inhospitable environments in the world, and they made it extremely productive, and they created this rich culture through that landscape. That is creativity, and that came from the type of walking and the type of thinking that came to Ladakhi people in that incredible landscape.
Absolutely, that's great. So to wrap up, the last thing, Tony, and to Garry. Tony, your foundation, being the Planet Wheelers Foundation, are developing all kind of projects all across the world. So tell us what I mean. Do you do any kind of thing in this part of the Himalaya where or you're planning to do anything in this part of to do with what you are known for?
Not directly. I mean, our work with the foundation has principally been education and health, and that certainly does extend into the Himalaya. I know that we're doing work in Nepal at the moment, but that education and health are worldwide things. I think you can go anywhere in the world and you need those two things, and I think they will continue to be extremely important everywhere, and the Himalaya included.
Yeah, absolutely, because we know how one person, Edmund Hillary, changed the whole the whole community, their future, where he managed to put up. So same is with Garry, who has been doing a lot of work in different parts of the Himalaya with the Australian Himalayan Foundation. And I saw many a times, Garry, your people working and going into the remote parts of Ladakh, and I've seen doctors. I've seen Dr. Nurbu going in on behalf of AHF and working in Sanskrit. Tell us, these kind of initiatives which you are doing, how beneficial it's I mean, is it beneficial definitely it's beneficial, but how difficult is to bring in support from your side to here, raising money, funds? Is it easily available, or it's very difficult? It's a struggle to do that.
It will always be a struggle. You mentioned about the traditional healers, the Anchi, which was in fact the original sponsor for that was the Planet Wheeler Foundation. So, and I've always been grateful. That was about sort of 15 years ago, and we've been able, by raising funds, to get the trainers, the top Amchi trainers from other parts of Ladakh to go into the Zanskar, and they've been running workshops. They've done a wonderful job. Our job really with the Australian Himalayan Foundation is empowerment, i.e. by providing the resources so that people can respect their local traditions and culture, and this way health practices, which again, 10 years ago, the Indian government finally got round to recognising now, and that's a wonderful step forward. But India now does recognize its traditional medical practices, Ayurvedic, that's the way they're looking, and good on them as well. We just play a very, very small part in that. And believe me, to have be a recipient of sort of Australian government funding, believe me, that is something I wouldn't want to put my worst enemy through in order to ensure that funds are placed for the purpose intended. We go through a really rigorous process there. It's one of the accredited agencies. Yep, there's so much to do, but we can only do as much as we can do.
Well, great, Garry. So, but just to final, do you have? Are you planning to do the rest of the Himalaya which have left? When you plan to do that long walk to all the way to the bend of Tsangpo, are you planning to do any time, or what's your plan ahead, or do you get time to go on such a walk now because you're so busy doing so many things, Jono?
I think we can all understand the pressures of families, but who knows? I would love to be able to do the Great Himalayan Trek with my kids. My kids are teenagers now, and maybe one or both of them would show interest in that. And in that case, yes, I would definitely love to do it, to finish off the trek across Nepal. So fingers crossed.
Absolutely great. It's been really amazing, and I'm so honored to I'm just going to wrap this up and really thank you, and I think I just should need to ask one more question, because I've been following the Lonely Planet for so long. It's it was like a Bible for all the travelers in the in all across the world. Tell us the last question, Tony. Tell us, where do you see Lonely Planet in the coming decades? There's so many things happening in the. Where do you see it going? I know you're not now very much involved, but still, it's your baby.
Yeah, it is very difficult to know where it's going to go. I always quote that American baseball player, Yogi Berra, who said it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And I think that's very true. We do not know what's going to happen. And I think, this past year has been a year of constant surprises, most of them not very pleasant surprises. But I always have hope. And, we've talked, Garry's been talking about the necessity of getting that vaccine out. And it does look like a vaccine is much, much closer now. And we may see it very soon. And maybe that will turn things around. And maybe we will be able to get out on the trails again next year with the vaccine in our arm. I hope so.
Absolutely. It's thank you so much, and let's hope this pandemic gets over as early as possible, as soon as possible, and we are all out in the outdoors, enjoying what we enjoyed doing it. Thank you so much again, all three of you, for being part of this lit festival of Ladakh, and on behalf of the organizer, I'm really grateful for giving us your precious time and to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Motab Jile.